I've been planning this all out since you told me. Edward here from ERViewer.com. I have a special guest in my home, my friend Paul Smith, former military remote viewer, all-around awesome dude, one of the greatest remote viewers alive today, trained by Ingo Swan, and he is in my home, and I'm so glad to have him here again. Paul, thanks so much for being here.
Flatterer.
I'm a butt kisser. I'm going to ask Paul some questions. Since I got him here, I'm going to take advantage of Paul's visit and ask him some in-depth remote viewing questions, things that I always have on my mind. And since I have access to Paul, I'm going to go ahead and ask him. Paul, one of the main things that I always love to ask you about when I have access to you is if you could tell us in the non-textbook version of what the ideogram is in stage one is to you, non-textbook. Give me your feeling, how you experience it. I want to know how you experience it. Take me into a stage one process inside of the mind of Paul Smith.
Am I feeling emotion on this?
Exactly. What happens to you when you go through stage one? When you receive an ideogram? Give me a description of what you experience.
So first, for the listening audience, I'm getting these questions are fresh to me. I didn't get preloaded on these, so I'm going to have to improvise as I go.
Absolutely.
So let me see if I can get into that mental space that I can describe it. So when I take the coordinate, or as some folks call it, a target reference number, when I take that down, I move my pen very quickly because you don't want the ideogram happening in the air. Right? You want to make sure you have your pen on the paper when it comes. It just sort of unfolds, but it unfolds very quickly. My ideograms I make very rapidly. I think that's.
Let me ask you this. Give me an example, if you could, or that moment when you, in your own exploration of remote viewing and training, or even with Ingo, when you had to distinguish between receiving and creating.
Okay, so yeah, that's actually a good starting point here. So the first thing you have to remember is ideograms, at least from the way Ingo and Hal, both of them were involved in this, Hal Puthoff, the way he conceived of them is that each one is an individual thing. Mm-hmm. That it is, the spontaneous is really meant on purpose. Spontaneous doesn't mean that you just initiate it spontaneously, it's that the ideogram itself is spontaneous. It emerges out of somewhere inside of you, and each one is unique for each target that you get. Now, there might be some family resemblances between, like the Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, the Great Pyramid. Ideograms you might have for those might have some resemblance because they're all structures. Mm-hmm. But each one will be unique and individual for that particular target. And so my struggle when I first started learning to do stage one with Ingo was that I kept wanting to make them all the same. Mm-hmm. And what happens there is that as I find my students when I'm teaching them in a formal classroom setting, they often have a hard time letting their right brain work without the left brain interference. The left brain wants to control. Now, I know there'll be people out there saying left brain, right brain, you're oversimplifying. Yes, I'm oversimplifying, but it's a good way of talking about this to help you understand. Mm-hmm. The left brain wants to control things. The right brain is more the spontaneous side. And so people often will make the same ideogram over and over again as they're going through session after session after session, and they're not really getting the experience. They're not really getting the value that an ideogram can provide.
And if you could, you just go into what you would describe. What is the value of an ideogram? Explain to the people what you mean by that, because I think that
you're
one of the main things is
driving
that
the train, but I throw the switches here. I throw the switches. Let me finish this out.
Okay.
Keep that question because that's valuable. But I think it's a tangent right now.
All right.
So when I got to the point where Ingo was getting really tired of me doing the same old thing all the time, he made me do an ideogram drill. Now the way this worked is when we were first learning it, before we did did a stage 1 at all, he had us do an ideogram drill. The point was to loosen us up. He would give us a different point on the paper to start with each ideogram we did, and obviously this is a drill. It's a simulation. It's not a real experience, right? Mm-hmm. He'd give us a different point on the paper, up, down, left, right, whatever, and then he would state a target or whatever, and we were supposed to, like say the Eiffel Tower, we were supposed to execute an ideogram that struck us as being consistent with how the Eiffel Tower might be in three-dimensional space. When he saw me doing these things the same all the time, he said, okay, we're going to do an ideogram drill. So the interesting thing about this is he used an ideogram drill almost as punishment. He wouldn't have called it that, but his point was he felt like I was too stiff. I needed to loosen up, and so we did some ideogram drills. And at some point he still thought I was too stiff. He made me take a empty soda bottle that was there, put it under my wrist so that it acted like a ball bearing, so that I would create a very fluid.
Okay, to get the flow of it going.
Yeah.
The subtle flow of it.
Yeah, I don't know how well that worked, but I did get the message. And so I stopped trying to control, and I started trying to just let it happen, let it flow. No control, let it flow. That could be a good motto that we adopt.
There you go.
And then from that point on, my ideograms, every one of them is expressive in a different way, even though, like I said, there might be some family resemblance there. So, okay, so you had, what was your question? Oh, what's the value of an ideogram?
Yeah.
So, first thing, one of the values of this spontaneous, creative, individual kind of expression of an ideogram is that you can ascertain, you can get things about the target that you can't get from just a squiggle on the paper. The first counsel we got was don't look at the ideogram. He said, don't look at the ideogram for information. You're supposed to experience it essentially. There is, I think, a bad habit that a lot of people in the remote viewing community do is they'll make their ideogram mark on the table and then they'll look at it and describe where the mark goes on the paper.
Yes, I've seen people do it many times.
Yeah. And you're missing the value of the ideogram when you do that.
Right.
Because, in fact, you have a certain, I'm going to hold my hand up here, maybe you'll see it. You have a certain motion that your hand describes, but more than that, you have a motion that you experience. And so one example, an ideogram's orientation can be completely, on the paper, will be a certain way. It's confined in a two-dimensional space. But but the real target, the real ideogram, if you will, that's out there in the universe, is not two-dimensionally constrained. And so when you create it, you're trying to capture a 3 or 4-dimensional concept on two-dimensional space on the paper. Sometimes, and the orientation can be different, so sometimes the ideogram actually may emerge out of the page, and yet your pen stays on the paper. And if you're just describing how it looks on the paper, you don't capture that further dimensionality of it.
Right.
And so the example I always use is, let's say you have a ridge. Let's say the target's a ridge. Your stage 1 target obviously is going to be something simple, right? So let's say it's a knife-edged ridge. And you might sketch it on the paper as a straight line, just a straight wiggly line across the page. And yet, if you actually kinesthetically experience it the way you're supposed to, even as your pen is going horizontally across the page, you will feel that emerging up out of the page and going back down. And so you can have a line that you might describe as, it's going horizontally across the page, and yet you describe it as sloping up, peaking, sloping down. And yet you've just got a flat line. And somebody looking at it would say, well, where did this sloping up, sloping out come from? That's just a flat line.
Right.
Well, it's because the kinesthetics told you what was happening.
Yeah, right.
So that's one, and that's what we call the motion of the ideogram.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with how it looks on the paper. It's how we kinesthetically experience it. So one more thing, before you ask that question, one more thing. The other piece of it is the feeling. Okay, feeling means consistency of the target. A lot of people are a little confused and they think it means a texture. Like, oh, it feels rocky. No, it doesn't feel rocky. It feels hard or solid. It's a consistency target, and those are much more limited than textures. You have solid, hard, dense. You have fluidy, liquidy. You have gassy, airy, fluffy, whatever. Those are feelings in this sense. They're consistencies. And that information is extremely important in dealing with ambiguity of the nature of the target. If you don't get an accurate feeling, you can actually end way off in the wrong direction.
Right.
And there's a lot of detail going there. But now you can talk again.
Well, I think the thing that I think a lot of people miss or misunderstand, unless they go to your class, is that when this ideogram is received, that you don't know what point in time and space. Meaning that the typical rationality is that everything is horizontal and that you're
Right.
doing something that is going to be along those lines.
Then you're at ground level looking at it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that the key is that for someone to really open up to to actually experiencing the receiving of an ideogram is to unravel that belief that is, or that mindset that's where it is actually coming from.
Yeah.
And that's what it should represent. I think a lot of people get lost in that.
Yeah, because that's a preconception that you're
That's exactly a
looking at it from
preconception.
a certain perspective, and in stage one, actually, all bets are off. You have no idea what your point of view is because you only have a single point of view. Ingo stressed that. He said, "You're coming here. You have no dimensional reference."
Right.
Because you're in stage one. The aperture hasn't opened up enough. You don't have any landmarks, so to speak, to go from when you're in stage one.
Right.
So you don't know whether you're inside, outside, upside down, backwards, to one side or the other, behind it. You could be anywhere in relation to this target as far as point of view.
Mm-hmm.
When we say a point of view, it's not just visual, it's all of your senses, point of view of all of your senses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you execute an ideogram, you might be making it upside down on your paper for all you know.
I think that is such an important thing for people. I think that is what can snap people out of the preconception of the spatiality of the ideogram. It's exactly what you just said. You could be anywhere upside down, and any angle, any point of view is where that ideogram could be representing.
And Ingo cautioned us about that. He said there was a big point he'd emphasized that you can't assume what your perspective is in stage one.
Right.
And over time, I will say this, that with practice, and you have to be really conscientious about this, with practice you can tend to impose a certain point of view, but you can never count on it because your subconscious or whatever mechanism it is below our conscious awareness, whatever it is, has a mind of its own, so to speak, right? And so it will give you what it wants you to get, right? And plus it also depends somewhat on tasker intentionality, what the tasker's intent is. It has to do with a lot of things, which is there's so many variables, that's why you can't count on what you're getting. But if you actually do the motion feeling part, if you're actually experiencing that kinesthetics, that will be actually what saves the day in terms of orientation stuff. It will help you understand that. Now, here's something that people like to say, well, it goes sloping to the right. And I say, baloney. It's not sloping to the right. You have no idea what right or left is here.
That's so key. People need to understand exactly what it means that you're saying. That when that comes through, you don't know if it's right, up, down, left, or what direction it's coming.
You do know up and down.
How can you know up and down
Okay.
if it's
So
right and left?
So right and left are what in philosophy we call indexicals, right? They're completely dependent on your starting point of view. So if you're in front of it, left and right is one thing. If you're behind it, left and right is another thing. If you're above it, left and right is something else altogether, right? So those things are completely relative to where you're starting from. Up and down, well, we'll just say down because that's relevant. We always seem to, I won't say always, but usually seem to have kind of an innate feel for where gravity is. Gravity is as close to a universal as we get in the physical world. And so I can't tell you how that happens. Maybe we've got some kind of mechanism like an iPhone does that tells you where the center of the earth is. I don't know. But we always seem to have an innate sense of what's up and what's down. Now, that can be overridden by our left brain beliefs, right? We can impose an artificial sense of where up and down is. The key, of course, is to learn to let go of that and just let your intuition tell you where up and down is in terms of executing the ideogram. And that will come through in the kinesthetics. You'll intuitively feel where up is and intuitively feel where down is. And when you master that, and I have to tell you, this is not something that comes instantly, because our world is based on left brain control. And when you start remote viewing, no matter how intuitive you've been in the past, you're still going to struggle with that. And so you have to learn to get your left brain off doing something else, and recognize when you're getting that underlying non-directive kind of an experience. And that will, once you've learned that, then you will have this intuition knowing what's up and what's down when you're doing an ideogram.
Excellent.